Hi Anne, I thought it would be great if you could talk to us about how academics can contribute to the work of the IASB. And to start with, can you talk us through the standard setting process?
Yes, Matt. Looking at slide 3, we've identified 4 phases in the standard setting process. And the one we want to talk about today in particular is the research projects phase. Many people are aware that we have an agenda and an agenda setting process, which leads into standard setting projects. But in addition, we have a research projects pipeline, and within our research projects, we have active projects and a pipeline. The 4th box on slide 3 refers to the post-implementation reviews, and we can talk about those as well later, Matt.
So first of all, perhaps you can tell us, why does the IFRS have a research program?
We've taken on a research program as a way of identifying whether there is a financial reporting problem that we should be addressing. Rather than taking things directly into standard setting, we do preliminary work to identify the issues in relation to the matter and also to gather evidence. The aim of this process is to shorten the time that a project is in the standard setting phase.
How can academics find out more about IFRS research?
Matt, looking at slide 6 now, the slide gives some website addresses related to the IASB website and the research centre on that website. Within the website, we have explanations of how we're using research within standard setting. The when, the how, the why, if you will. We also have information about research opportunities. In particular, we're very proud about our IASB Research Forum. The 5th one will occur this year in Sydney in November. We have other information on our website about the post-implementation reviews and other research that we are accessing in our standard setting process.
What are the active research projects and what is coming up in the research pipeline?
Matt, if we look on slide 7, we can see that 7 active research projects are mentioned, and I'd like to speak about those in more detail as we proceed today. But first, let's look at the research pipeline, which is on slides 8 and 9. The research pipeline lists a number of projects. These have been brought to our attention through the agenda consultation process, the interpretations committee, or through other means. You can see them listed there, and I'll briefly touch on what's in the pipeline because it's very relevant for academic research. So, firstly, equity method. This will come up as part of the post-implementation review of IFRS 11. Secondly, extractive industries. We have an interim standard, IFRS 6, and we believe it's time to have a further look on the topic of extractive industries. Thirdly, pollutant pricing mechanisms. We're aware of diversity in practice, so we want to take a look and see whether there should be some standard setting in this area. Fourth, provisions. People are aware that we have recently released the revised conceptual framework. There are implications of the framework for the IAS 37 work that we have done on provisions, and we will now get back to that now the framework's been released. We're looking at some of these other projects to see the scope of them, and that includes variable and contingent consideration. Some issues have been raised with us. We need to have a look and see what the scope of any research project should be. Going now to slide 9, high inflation is a topical issue in some countries, and this project will have a look about whether IAS 29 could be amended in a very narrow way to consider high inflation rather than hyperinflation. In terms of pensions, IAS 19, there's a question that would be very narrow scope, something that we can have a look at there. And finally, SMEs that are subsidiaries. The issue here is whether the recognition and measurement of IFRS standards could be used together with disclosure requirements of SMEs. So research will have a look at that, whether it's a beneficial project and whether worthy of proceeding. Now, going to slide 10, we've listed some points there to highlight to researchers that the research pipeline is an excellent place to look when considering research to be undertaken. Projects in the research pipeline will be looked at in the next 1 to 3 years, so there is a much longer lead time for researchers to get busy with their work. The topics in some cases are quite broad, they're open, there are a lot of issues. Equity accounting is an example of that. There are also areas where some academics already have experience and expertise that would be relevant, and extractive industries and pollutant pricing mechanisms are examples. So I do encourage researchers to take a look into the research pipeline and see what projects in there are of interest to them and areas where they would be able to contribute evidence to the research work.
Something else that you mentioned earlier on were post-implementation reviews that we typically undertake 3 to 5 years after a standard has come into practice to see how it's going. So could you talk to us about those post-implementation reviews?
Yes, Matt. If we look at slide 11, we have a list there for post-implementation reviews, and we have completed our post-implementation review on 13, fair value measurement, and interested people can see the results of that. Coming up next, IFRS 10, 11 and 12, and we will be commencing those in a short time frame. We're also going to do a post-implementation review of IFRS 5, because we want to investigate how that standard is working in practice. Further out will be the post-implementation reviews of the newer standards, 9, 15, 16 and eventually 17. Post-implementation reviews are where the board looks at whether a standard is working as intended. It's an area where academics can really help us with our work. We need evidence about how the standard is being used and the impact the standard is having. These are things that can be spoken to via research projects, so I do encourage people to think about post-implementation reviews as they think about their research projects.
Going back to those projects that are currently active, I wondered if you could talk us through each of those and help us understand those better. So let's start with the principles of disclosure.
Yes, Matt. So looking at slide 13, we've just given a diagram there and 3 bullet points that emphasise feedback we received as part of the principles of disclosure discussion paper. The things highlighted to us were not enough relevant information, too much irrelevant information, and ineffective communication. There are several ways that the board is considering responding to the feedback we've received, and slide 14 gives us an overview of various issues that the board and staff will be looking at in the months ahead. As we go now to slide 15, I've listed there some research opportunities specifically relating to the disclosure initiative. So on slide 14, the areas of the project have been identified in the diagram, and this would suggest to us that we want more evidence about the impact for users of location of information. We want to know more about the value from alternative performance measures. Now, Matt, these go by many names, but referring here to non-GAAP or non-IFRS measures. Some people call them with those names. We need to know more about those. We want to know more about the factors that help promote useful disclosure in the complex and the subjective areas. So thinking about routine versus non-routine disclosures, non-recurring events, things that are commercially sensitive, and of course things that have estimations and judgments in them. We'd also like to know more about how different approaches in standards are effective in promoting material disclosure. So some of our prior recent work has highlighted materiality judgments and materiality considerations. And principles of disclosure is about getting more material disclosure that's relevant for the users. So what's the best way to do this? Is it about having principles of disclosure or objectives, disclosure objectives? What's the role of the specific requirements in standards? We have some examples in IFRS 3 and IAS 36 that the researchers might like to look at, but we're very keen to get more evidence to help us with this project.
In line with that, or related to that project, I guess, is the second of the areas we were looking at, primary financial statements.
Yes, Matt. So primary financial statements has picked up some of those things raised in the principles of disclosure feedback. The alternative performance measures or management performance measures is one issue. But we also touch on some of those other things. The focus of the primary financial statements project, as shown in slide 16, is the statement of financial performance. If we turn to slide 17, I've listed some suggestions of things we'd like to know more about. In relation to the primary financial statements, we'd like to know more about current practices that entities use, and we're of course very interested in cross-country patterns and practices. We need to understand more about the extent of diversity in presentation and what sort of factors are explaining the diversity we see and also the presentation choices that entities make. We'd like to know more about how the choices entities make impact on transparency and comparability of the information provided. How do users of information deal with these variations in presentation? We know for users that comparability is important, but we also know they value entity-specific information. Primary financial statements is about getting some trade-off between those two important elements. And finally, on slide 17, if we were to make changes, what are the costs and benefits of these possible changes?
Another area that the board has been looking at recently, and certainly research would help, is business combinations under common control, sometimes referred to as BCUCCs.
Yes, BCUCC. Matt, this project's come about because BCUCCs are excluded from the scope of IFRS 3. So the project is considering the diversity that exists in practice with a particular eye on the information needs of people external to the group. If we turn now to slide 20, we have some suggestions of research questions relating back to the prior slide, which is beginning to say what sort of things we might be looking at as we consider different methods, the acquisition method, other ways we might measure amounts that are going to be relevant in this combination. So our questions are about which methods are applied in practice, this acquisition method as in IFRS 3 or a predecessor method or some other method. Often researchers identify descriptive statistics from their data taken from financial statements. This can be very useful for standard setters. We're always interested in the views of preparers and users, and academics are well positioned with their skills to undertake interview work and survey work. We're interested in the information asymmetry that exists between the restructuring entity and the investors. As I mentioned, we're concerned about people outside the group and how they might be affected by these group transactions. They don't have the information that the insiders do. So there are a number of interesting questions that flow out from the mergers and acquisitions work, but in this specific situation, we're dealing with transactions between insiders. So there's additional factors to consider that should be very interesting for researchers.
Another project with a slightly nicer acronym, our FICE, or Financial Instruments with Characteristics of Equity, is also an interesting area to potentially look at.
Yes, Matt, interesting and very challenging. We will be releasing the discussion paper on FICE very shortly, and some of our academic colleagues will be aware that the FICE project has been looking at the distinction between debt and equity and has gone into a great deal of work and made many proposals on how we might improve the way that entities can make that distinction between what consists of liability or what is an equity. So the standard here is IAS 32. It's been with us for quite some time. Many aspects of it are working in practice, but there are some areas that are still causing difficulty.
And finally, a topic that seems to be a bit of a perennial topic in accounting and standard setting, goodwill and impairment.
Yes, Matt, it's still on our research agenda. We did receive a lot of feedback through the post-implementation review of IFRS 3 of business combinations, and that feedback alerted us to complexity and cost related to the impairment test. The feedback suggested that there are delays in the recognition of impairment, and in the view of some, there are inadequate disclosures. This has led to a lot of work with the board and staff, considering ways in which we might improve the requirements of IFRS 3 and the associated standard IAS 36. We're planning on releasing some sort of consultation document, but the board is still working on that. So I do encourage people who have research on goodwill and impairment to please make it available to the academic community, to let us know about research if we're not aware of it, if it wasn't part of our post-implementation review. We're very interested to hear what people have been finding in their further research, and we're very interested in any evidence and light they might shed on this particularly testing topic, goodwill and impairment.
Well, Anne, it seems there are many issues academics can consider. Do you have any final comments?
Yes, Matt. I'd like to encourage researchers to take a look at these slides, consider them within the light of the board papers that accompany all these projects and highlight what our thinking is. I would really encourage researchers to follow the IASB research program and keep an eye on the pipeline via the IFRS website. So I would encourage them to look to see where their work could contribute to the standard setters' activities. This is a great opportunity for academics to show that their work has impact in the wider community through making contributions into the standard setting process.
Well, Anne, thank you for talking to us about research and standard setting. There is information on how to contact us on the screen now. And as you said, we're always interested in hearing about good, relevant research that can really help us make better standards.
Indeed. Thank you, Matt.